Hello and welcome to the FL Studio music production course. In this first lesson, we're going to walk through the entire process of making a beat. Don't worry if you don't understand all of this by the end of the episode. This is intended as a brief introduction to the FL Studio music production software and will simply allow you to understand the rough process of making a track so that we can dive deeper into the intricacies later in the course. To begin this lesson, upon opening FL Studio, you will automatically be loaded into this area. This is called the playlist, and this is where we will create our final composition once we've added all of the various instruments and sounds. However, we haven't created any of these yet, so we're moving to another area first. Before we do that, we'll need to adjust the tempo. We'll do this by dragging our mouse over this button up here. We can hold left click whilst dragging up or down to increase or decrease the tempo. Be aware that holding to the right side of this number will adjust it slightly, while dragging on the left side will adjust it more significantly. For this project, we're going to use a tempo of 140 beats per minute. All different genres and subgenres of music will use their own tempo. A quick Google search will tell you exactly what these are. Now that we have set the tempo, we're going to start by creating a melody. A melody is just one component of a composition. I like to break all of my tracks down into 5 sections: melody, bass lines, drums, effects, and vocals. You can start with any of these, but you'll find that the majority of producers like to start with the melody first, as it sets the foundation of the track. To create this melody, we'll begin by opening up the channel rack by left clicking up here and clicking on this plus button to add a plugin. I've decided to use GMS for this melody. Inside of GMS, you can click on this button here to load all of the presets. These are ready-made sounds for you to use in your beats. For this beat, we'll be taking Synth 12, which is under leads and synths and down here. Now that we have our sound, we'll need to go into the piano roll. So we can close this here and right click on GMS and click piano roll. As you can see, there's a piano on the left hand side of the screen. Essentially, this piano roll is like a graph, with the pitch or note on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. The lower down you go, the deeper the pitch will be, and the further up you go, the higher this will be. We're now going to start by drawing our melody in. You may need to adjust your snap to grid, so left click on this magnet button up here and select a quarter beat. These simply determine the increments between each adjustment. Here's what it looks like if I set it as a bar. And here's what it looks like if I set it as quarter step. Again, let's set this as a quarter beat. To briefly explain the different terms here, there are 4 steps in a beat and 4 beats in a bar. So essentially, a quarter beat is the same as a step. We can now left click anywhere on this piano roll to draw notes in. By hovering over the note and holding left click, we can move this to whichever position we want it to be in. And by left click and dragging on the end of the note, we can shorten or elongate it. Lastly, if you add a note that you wish to delete, you can simply right click to remove this. We are now going to draw a melody in the A minor key, and we'll start on the root of the scale, which is A. One of the many great functionalities inside of FL Studio is the scale highlighting tool. By clicking up here and going to view, we can change scale highlighting to A minor. Now we can see that the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G are in the scale. So we can make a melody with any of these notes and it will always be in key. Here's an example of this. Notice that if I move a note out of the scale, it will sound off. For this melody, I'm going to start with a simple 1-5 chord progression. This simply means that the bass notes of my chords are number 1 in the scale, so A, and number 5 in the scale, so E. For variation, I'm going to add number 7 in the scale, which is G. So this part would now be a 1-5-7 progression. I also decided that I want to pull these down an octave. We're now going to turn these into power chords by adding the 5th to each bass note. So we're going to start counting from the bass note and add a note 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to do this for all of the bass notes. Here's how this will now look and sound. Now we need to add a top-line melody. There's not too much of a science here. You're simply using the notes in the scale to create a melody above the chords, and this can be whatever you like the sound of. This is what I came up with. A quick note, creating melodies can seem very complicated, especially with music theory playing a key part. Don't worry about this too much for the time being. I've got a module later in the course dedicated specifically to this. Again, the purpose of this first lesson is just to familiarise yourself with FL Studio. Now that we have the melody down, we're going to add a bass line. This part is super simple, but before we do this, we need to make sure that the frequencies in the melody don't clash with the bass line. To do this, we're going to open the channel rack and assign the melody to its own mixer channel by left clicking here and dragging up to assign it to the next free mixer track, which in this case is 5. We can then click this button up here to open the mixer. This is where all of the effects are added to our sounds. We can go to the 5th insert, which is where the melody is, and then click on an empty slot up here to add a new effect. Here we're going to use Fruity Parametric EQ2. We want to remove the bass frequencies from the sound, so we're going to filter them out. To do this, we click up here and select this preset, 20Hz to 18 kHz cut. We can then drag this low pass filter to 100 Hz. You'll see this demonstrated in the top left hand corner of the screen. Whilst I'm here, I've noticed there's some harsh high frequencies, which you may be able to hear or see on the EQ. So let's cut these out with the high pass filter too. Now back to the bass line. We need to add a bass sound, so we're going to go back into the channel rack by left clicking up here and opening another GMS plugin by clicking plus and GMS. Now we could select a ready-made preset for the bass, but I've decided that we should make our own, and this is how we'll do it. First, open up the presets and select user and default. To create the bass sound, we're going to adjust the following parameters. Left click and drag here to around 50 to 60%. Left click the stereo width and drag upwards to increase this to 100%. Increase the voices by clicking and dragging upwards to 8. Drop this down 2 octaves as it's going to be a deep bass sound. And reduce the cutoff to around 50%. For the purpose of this lesson, we're familiarising ourselves with FL Studio, so I won't explain the entire process of sound design. This will require an entire lesson, which is later in the course. We can now close GMS and right click on it in the channel rack and go into the piano roll. Since we already have the bass notes for our chords, which are the lowest notes, we just need to copy these. Rather than drawing these in, we can do this more efficiently by double right clicking the highlighted melody. Or we could have gone back into the channel rack and right clicked on Piano Roll for GMS and highlighting these while pressing Ctrl and Shift and left click and dragging over these bass notes. Once we've highlighted all of these, we can press Ctrl and C. We can then go back into the channel rack, right click on GMS number 2, which is the bass line, and go back into the piano roll. Then we can press Ctrl V. After listening to this bass line, I've noticed that it's a bit too deep, so we're going to press Ctrl and the up arrow to move it up an octave. We now have our melody and bass line, which we can listen to by going into the piano roll and pressing space, or clicking play up here. Note that you have to have this on pattern mode and not song mode. You may find that the sounds may be too loud or quiet. You can adjust this by opening up the channel rack and left click and dragging on these volume knobs here. Make sure it's the right knobs and not the left knobs, as these are for panning. This determines whether a sound's played in your left or right ear. Here's an example of this. We can now move on to the drums for this track. We need to add drum sounds to the channel rack. However, drums aren't in the form of plugins like GMS. Instead, we'll navigate in the browser along to the side of FL Studio and go to the drum section. Make sure you're on all up here for browser and go down to packs, left click, and then left click on drums. We'll need a kick, a clap, a hi-hat, a snare, and an open hat. I decided to use the 808 kick. We can add this by left click and dragging this into the channel rack. I also took the 808 closed hat, this clap here, the 808 snare, and the 808 open hat. Now to actually create the pattern. It's standard to use a simple 2-step hi-hat pattern, which we can do by right clicking on the closed hat and selecting fill each 2 steps. We can then add the clap on the 3rd beat of the bar by simply left clicking. If you misclick and you want to delete any of these notes, you simply have to right click to remove them. For the open hat, we'll add this on the 2nd beat of the 1st and 3rd bars. And finally, this simple kick pattern and this snare pattern to add a bit of bounce throughout the pattern. Here's how this now sounds. Listening to this, the open hat sounds a little bit loud, so I'm going to left click and drag downwards to decrease the volume of the open hat. Finally, I also noticed that the 808 kick doesn't sound particularly punchy, and there's a long tail on the volume. So now we're going to click on the kick in the channel rack and increase this out knob to shorten the kick. Here's how this now sounds. Now that we have all of the elements down, we can right click up here and select split by channel. This will split the pattern that we created into all of the individual sounds. We can now click up here to go back into the playlist, which we saw at the beginning of the video, and we can see all of the individual sounds listed here. If you can't see this, it's because you need to select the pattern mode up here. We can then left click and drag to put all of these into the playlist. For this beat, let's start the intro with the melody, then add drums, and then add the bass line later. So we can left click and drag to move these across. Again, if we want to remove any of these elements, we can simply right click. A quicker method to add these in is to hold Control and drag over certain elements and press Ctrl B to duplicate these. Here's how the final beat will now sound. And that wraps up the first lesson. We've created our very first beat. Now that you've seen the full process from start to finish of creating a beat, we can start to dive a little deeper into the specific areas of music production.